I think the issue is, it's kind of an interesting thing. If you travel to Switzerland and you start looking around at the space standards and how they create office environments, they dictate quite categorically that you're only supposed to have an office desk a certain number of meters away from a window. And in fact, if you work further inboard than their standards would say, then apparently you get paid a higher salary, which is kind of interesting. So that creates a situation where to make a building, I mean, the cost of building a building is X. The cost of actually providing all the people that work in the buildings is 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 times X over the life of the building. So the cost of actually hiring people and putting them into spaces has got to come into play. So what the Swiss are doing is they're really recreating the working environments and minimizing the depth of the office footplate so that they can ensure that people are connected to daylight, connected to the natural world in a way which I think is a very healthy thing. Now, in some environments such as London or New York or some of the bigger cities, you know, the whole thing of massive floor plates or huge trading floors for traders and the like, it's never going to happen in terms of having, you know, a 10-story building where you've got big floor plates and having natural light coming in and having an impact on the heart of the building. But I do believe that there are ways in which you can, if you can't necessarily utilize the real thing, you can still create visual connections, psychological connections to what is happening outside in the heart of the space that still means that you have this connection to what's happening in the real world.
I mean, Jonathan, I mean, I'm at the Royal College of Art. We have a very well-established architecture school, and I noticed that the students and staff talk a lot about daylight and the effect on buildings and structure and urban form and so on. There's very little debate about artificial lighting and the technologies and palette of artificial lighting. So really, I come to you. Do you think there's something missing in an architectural education?
100% yes. It's interesting, if I put on get my Zimmer frame out and all the rest of it and talk about 30-odd years ago when I trained to be an architect, my lighting design education then has changed a little bit since then, but it was then how many lux will I have on this desk if I have a 6-foot fluorescent tube on the ceiling in a 3-meter high space. And I looked around all my colleagues at architecture school, and they were all going, "Oh my God, this is boring. This is really tedious, and there's no inspiration. There's no, design aspiration here beyond this number crunching calculation." And almost to a person, they said, "Thank goodness there are engineers who can do this stuff for me." And my attitude's always been that, that kind of education, it still happens in many schools around the world today, is actually turning architectural students off to what should be an amazing opportunity, that if they're thinking about their buildings in a holistic, complete manner, they have to think about it across a 24-hour cycle. They also have to think about it in a seasonal cycle when daylight changes and all the rest of it. And it doesn't seem to happen. I think it's got better over the years, but I still believe that there's a huge lack in encouraging architects to grasp light as a medium that they can use constructively, creatively, to make their spaces and their buildings fantastic.
I mean, I'm always, you and I share, Jonathan, a love of that famous Le Corbusier definition of architecture as being the masterly correct and magnificent play of masses brought together in light. I don't think you can beat that. I've got one more question in this part of our webinar on light and architecture. This is from Terence, who is an architect, and he says, "How can we help people to turn off lights in offices when the daylight is quite acceptable?"
It's interesting, the whole debate, and I think Claudia's treatise in a book is admirable and positive. I think to turn that into reality in our working environments is very tricky when you have large spaces. But I think the more automation that occurs, where if there is a goodly amount of light that's entering the space from daylight, then sensors, photocell sensors, whatever kind of sensors, would control the amount of artificial light that's being used. I despair when I walk into some buildings which are beautifully daylit and all the downlights are on, or the uplights are on, or whatever may be on. And the energy that's being wasted unnecessarily is just crazy. And it's interesting that some buildings I go into, when I see that, I do know that they have a system that works, that has this ability. But for whatever reasons, the facilities management side of things don't keep on top of it. The maintainability of that whole system doesn't seem to be followed through. So I think there's a disconnect between people's belief in doing things the right way and the reality of how people then maintain it and keep things going.
Great, Jonathan. Well, thanks. Stay with us. We're going to widen the debate now, and we're going to hear from another contributor to the Light Volumes Dark Matter seminar. And this is Jane Withers, design consultant and writer, and one of the leading curators in lighting design internationally. Jane's exhibitions include a retrospective on Jean Nouvel at the ICA, and In Praise of Shadows, a show on lighting and energy at the V&A as part of the 2009 London Design Festival. Jane graduated in art history at the Courtauld Institute and has an MA in design history from the RCA's joint course with the V&A. Jane comes to curation from a background writing on design and architecture for newspapers and magazines, including The Times and The Face. She was deputy editor of Elle Decoration during the 1990s. She's now contributing design editor for Wallpaper magazine. So let's hear from Jane Withers.
Firstly, I should say I'm a design curator, not a lighting expert. Last year, when I was invited to do an exhibition on New European design, I decided to focus on light because with all the issues around energy and sustainability, it's an area undergoing a massive technological change. There's amazing creativity in the field, and yet I find it frustrating that much of the debate was so limited. In a nutshell, technology seems to get all the airplay, but the human and emotional dimensions of lighting tend to be ignored. There's all the talk about codes and lamps and lux, as Jonathan said, but I felt there were bigger questions we might be asking about how we want to light our lives. So for this exhibition in Praise of Shadows, I wanted to bring together mainly quite emerging designers who explore not just the potential of low energy lighting and alternative energy sources, but the qualities of light. Probably quite a few of you are familiar with the essay referred to in the exhibition title, In Praise of Shadows. It was written by the Japanese novelist Tanizaki in 1933, and he describes the differences between East and Western cultures in terms of sensibility towards light. And he characterizes the shadows, the richness, the depth and the mysteries of Japanese culture being blasted away by the sort of harsh glare of westernization. I mean, that was almost a century ago, but sometimes it still seems true. The mantra, the brighter the better, has held sway for a lot of the 20th century. And as Jonathan was describing, we still seem to get fried in overlit offices, or the bland, sort of disorientatingly uniform lighting of airports, supermarkets, and even hospitals. One thing I should say is that visitors were given wind-up torches to navigate their own way around the exhibition. As much as anything else, it was sort of thrilling to see how when they're in control of light and chose their own levels, there was a sort of sense of exploration. Another theme in the exhibition was looking about alternative energy sources, and this is Dutch designers the Mackers fan, a particularly elegant solution to wind-powered street lighting. The exhibition ended on a sort of cautionary note about energy waste and light pollution. Maybe you've come across French eco-activists, Clondineon. They protest against the sort of absurd waste of advertising by going around and turning lights off. And I think this shows them running down, I think the one on the left is the Rue de Rivoli, and they're sort of turning off boutique lights using the emergency switches for the fire brigade. I mean, it's interesting, just a few years, they sort of spread across Europe, across France, in Holland, Belgium, Germany, and totally we've got the International Earth Day. And I think that as much as new light technologies, it's thinking like this about how we use energy that can help change our habits and point the way to a more sustainable future.
Okay, so that was Jane Withers, curator, and we're now going to have another Q&A on lighting design. Questions are coming in. Jonathan Spears is still with us, and so is Fred Bass. And the first question has come from Lucas, who describes himself as an editor. And he says, how would you see the design of a typical office change in the future, given the findings from the research?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think I would say immediately task lighting. I was thinking just when Jonathan was speaking earlier, you know, the way to deal with someone turning off the central control system or whatever it is, give the individuals control, put the task lighting on the desk, and when the daylight comes streaming through the windows, they'll do something about it, and they'll control their own space. So I think it's a very strong message, I think, for design in the future of offices, is give some proper task lighting to the individuals, every single workstation, and stop trying to get too sort of big brother about it and controlling everything on a massive system in the building.
I mean, it's Jeremy Meyerson speaking here. I'm Helen Hellman, Professor of Design at the Royal College of Art, and I supervised the research that Claudia Dutson carried out. I think Claudia's study occupied a space between two conflicting strategies. One was reducing light levels, especially overhead ambient light levels, to save energy and create a calmer and less hot and stressful environment. That was one strategy, but she also observed widely the opposite strategy, which was to raise light levels to stimulate alertness and use different types of light, melatonin suppression light and that kind of thing, in order to encourage well-being. So in some cases, more light was being flooded into the environment, and in some cases less. But generally, I think the research pointed towards the direction of lower general ambient light levels. And this is especially in the context of an aging workforce who found very stressful and tiring, very high uniform light levels, and more towards task lighting, which you have local control over. And this comes back to the early thing we talked about, whereas you can respond locally to daylighting. Jonathan, would you like to comment on this?
Sure. I think the ability to be able to control your own environment psychologically has been proven as being a sensible way forward. I think that to have every single desk light with a presence sensor on it, so that if you walked away from your desk to go to get a cup of coffee, go to a meeting, go to the bathroom, whatever it may be, then your own desk light would fade out or switch off until you came back, would ameliorate some of the energy consumption that's used by that. But I think certainly by giving you control of your own individual workspace makes, to me, a huge amount of sense. We've tried over the years with groupings of people sitting in large open plan desks to have a situation where people could almost vote. A cluster of 6 people in one area could vote as to whether they want to have higher lighting or lower lighting, and they could control it on their telephone